Thank you so much for inviting me, particularly Richard, but to the whole club. I love talking about this subject. It's called Astrophilately. It's a FIP class, and I like to refer to Astrophilately as the intersection between space and postal history. And that's really what we're teaching people about space flight and about history, and we're doing it with postage stamps. So Astrophilately, telling the story of the conquest of space through stamps. And I want to illustrate that by just giving you a sample story and showing you how we might build an exhibit that would qualify as Astrophilately. So let's say, for example, I wanted to tell the story of a space plane. Well, you'd kind of reach back and you'd say, well, let's see, the first space plane was actually a rocket plane. It was an experimental plane called the X-15, and that flew in the 1960s. And so here's an envelope that has a cachet on the left that's got a picture of the plane, flying. It happens to be autographed by the pilot, Scott Crossfield, and it's postmarked at Edwards Air Force Base in California on the day that they had their first powered flight. So Astrophilately is all about the postmark. It's not about the stamp. It's not about routes. It's not about rates. It's not about cachets. It's not about autographs. It's about postmarks. And I will just beat that into your head. So if we're talking about a space plane, there are lots of different pieces. And one of them is kind of a proof of concept. How could you have a plane that could fly in space and then come back and land on the Earth? So we know from objects that are coming from the outside the solar system, when a rock, a piece of iron and I don't know what else, comes into our atmosphere and burns up as a meteorite, you've got stuff that is rock that is burning. So the idea that you could take an airplane that's made out of aluminum and somehow get back from orbiting the Earth to the ground is kind of fantastical. But that's what the challenge was. So one of the ways of doing that was to say, well, the thing that's going to really burn off is going to be the wings, because those are very thin. And wouldn't it be great if we could find something that we could fly in orbit, but that could land, that had some lift to it, but didn't require wings? So they had these bathtub shapes that they call lifting bodies, where the fuselage actually provided lift and it didn't really have any wings. And this is Bill Dana, who actually was the last guy to fly the X-15 on an M2 flight in September of '72. And then once you've got your design for the space shuttle, you have to do all kinds of component testing. So, for example, you have a 10% scale model and you put it in a wind tunnel, and you're trying to figure out whether or not it's aerodynamically stable and all that sort of stuff. So this is canceled at Ames, where they're doing tests on wind tunnel tests. And then you have to train the pilots. And you do this in simulators, but you also you get a tremendous amount of fidelity if you could train the pilots to actually flying. So one of the crafts that they used was they took a business jet, a Gulfstream II, and changed its characteristics. They kind of dirtied it up so that it flew very poorly. So it had a great deal of drag, and it was difficult to fly, and they kind of turned it into what the space shuttle was going to be. And they would have an astronaut sitting in one seat, and they'd have a test pilot in the other, and the astronaut would be flying it like he was flying the space shuttle, and if some problem happened, the test pilot could take over. So this is canceled at White Sands, where they're doing the testing with the Gulfstream II. And it's autographed by two of the astronauts, by Richard Truly and Joe Engle, who ended up being the pilots on the second space shuttle mission. And then once you've created the space shuttle, you need to do a bunch of flight tests. Well, you don't want to start by sending it up into orbit and having a big complicated mission. So the first thing you do is you do ground tests where you test the braking, you see how it handles on the tarmac, and then you want to do approach and landing tests where you've got a space shuttle that we're not using its engines, we're not coming back from space, but you put it on back of a 747 and then release it, and then you see how it gets into the landing pattern and lands on the runway. So this is part of the ALT tests, the approach and landing tests at Edwards in 1977. And we're still maybe 3 years before the space shuttle actually flies. And then we get to the point where we're at the first flight. So the first flight of the space shuttle was on April 12th, 1981. And April 12th is kind of an interesting date in that the first successful V2 was fired on April 12th. And Yuri Gagarin, who was the first man in space, went into orbit on April the 12th. So it's kind of interesting. And so this is also the date of the first space shuttle of Columbia. And this one is called a contractor cover. So the cachet here was produced by the Radio Corporation of America because of their participation, because of their pride associated with being a participant as a subcontractor for the space shuttle. And you can see it's canceled at the Kennedy Space Center, which is the closest post office to the event that's being controlled, and on the day that the event happens. So that's how we're telling the history. We're saying what happened on April the 12th at the Kennedy Space Center. And the answer is the space shuttle first took off. And so, there'll be a bunch of these launch covers. So here's one for the second launch. This is Truly and Engel, and they left from the Kennedy Space Center on November 12th, 1981. So this was the first time that we'd taken a spacecraft and we reused it. So they sent it up, and a couple months later, we went ahead and used it again. But it's not just about the launch, right? Because there's a lot that's involved. There's launch, there's the coordination while it's in space, and then there's also the recovery, whether that recovery is in the ocean or landing on a runway. Now, in this particular case, before the space shuttle, Americans would land in the water and the Navy would pick them up. So you'd want to have an envelope that was canceled on the ship that picked them up. In this particular case, they're landing at on the dry lake beds at Edwards. And so you'd have a postmark that's canceled in California on November 14th, 1981, and that would represent the landing of the space shuttle. So it was up in space for 2 days, and then it came back. So at some point, and actually the space shuttle flew for 135 missions, and for the first 4, they were considered experimental. So they just had the 2 test pilots in it. They had ejection seats and parachutes and that sort of thing. They didn't do any science on these first 4 flights. But after that, it became operational. So they started adding mission specialists and payload specialists. Here, in this case, they were going to put a teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe. And so if I wanted to tell the story of the space shuttle being operational, I might have like this envelope. So this has a mission patch that we're using as the cachet. It's canceled at the Kennedy Space Center, and it's dated January 28th, 1986, which was 51L. That's when this space shuttle took off. But there's a lot more to this story than simply the launch of 51L. For one thing, when the space shuttle goes up, there's a main tank that burns up when it comes back in the atmosphere. And there are 2 solid rocket boosters, which are on either side. And when they come back by parachute, they land in the water, and a tugboat goes out and it drags them back, and they get sent back to Utah, and they get refurbished and they get used again. So this is canceled to tell you that part of the story, to tell you about the solid rocket boosters being recovered. Now, in this case, you might look at this and you say, well, let's see, February 3rd, 1984, Cape Canaveral. you would think this should be canceled on the ship. But it turns out that some ships are so small that they don't have post offices. So in Astrophilately, we consider the nearest port on the day you get back as being, as good as you can get. So for the ship Liberty, that's the recovery ship, it got back on February the 3rd, and Cape Canaveral was the closest post office, so that's considered acceptable. Now, this is kind of nice. This is Krista McAuliffe had her own patch. Being a teacher in space, she had all these lesson plans that she was going to work with the kids. She was a high school teacher, I guess actually a middle school teacher in New Hampshire. And she was chosen from like 10,000 people to do lesson plans from outer space. She was going to be the first civilian in outer space. And what I kind of like about this is, even though we generally don't pay any attention to the stamp, in this case, instead of a definitive, someone's put a public education stamp on it, which is kind of nice. And again, you see, January 28th, 1986 was the day that she launched in space. Now, in this particular case, the shuttle exploded, and she and the rest of the crew was killed. Now, this is a very rare cover. This one was carried on a submersible, the Sea Link, and it was operating to try to find pieces of the wreckage off the coast of Florida. So a couple of these were carried inside the submersible, and this helps to tell that poignant story. So this is canceled at the Kennedy Space Center in April, when they were trying to recover the wreckage. So Astrophilately is really about two things. It's telling the right date, which is the local time or the next business day for the event that we're trying to describe, and the right place, which is the closest post office to the controlling entity. So when I mean controlling entity, when the rocket goes up, you want it canceled in Florida because that's where they send up the rockets. But if you're talking about like walking on the moon, that's not controlled at the Kennedy Space Center. That's controlled at the Manned Space Flight Center in Houston, Texas. So you would want to postmark where the controlling event is. So if we're talking about something like, let's say, the International Space Station, if we're talking about something about that, the control center is in Texas. So you'd want a Texas postmark. So here's an envelope. It has a stamp. It's canceled. It's got a cachet on it. As a matter of fact, this is a very nice cachet for specialists, because this is done by Morris Beck. He was a World War II Navy veteran who did a lot of cachets for Fleet Day and for keel layings and things like that. And he also did a number of them for space events. And so he did one for each one of the manned space flights. And he would send a rubber stamp of these color ones to each one of the ships. So if you sent an envelope to a ship that was part of the recovery fleet, you would get this cachet. But for a couple of cents, you could send this to him and he would put this color cachet on it. This one for the first walk in space. This is Gemini 4. But what's interesting about this, there would normally be about 500 of these envelopes that would be on each ship. And they, underneath the cachet, would be a Beck number. So it would say B385. Now, in addition to those 500, he made 25 of them that didn't have a number. And he called these Beck crew cachets. And what this was is this was a thank you note to the crew for doing the work to postmark these envelopes. So of these 500, there are maybe 25 that don't have a number. And so one of the things that I look for is I look for these color ones, but I look for them without numbers. So here we have an envelope. It's canceled on the WASP on June 7th, 1965, which was the day that the Gemini crew got back from space. And this was the prime recovery ship. In a flotilla, you might have 20, 30, 40 different ships all over the world that are waiting for the astronaut to come back. But there's only one or two that have all the right equipment and a lot of training, and it's generally an aircraft carrier. And they're considered the prime recovery ship as opposed to a secondary recovery ship. So this is the prime recovery ship, June the 7th, 1965. And it has, we call this a VIP label. So it's got a typed label that's been put on it. Normally with an envelope that's been sent to a ship, someone will write their address on it and they'll, the envelope will be sent to them. But there were a number of people that, and I'm not sure who did this, maybe it was NASA, where they had a number of people that they wanted to send these things to. And so they had these little labels put on. So this is a VIP label, which doesn't really add any value. It's just kind of interesting. It's a Beck color cachet, but it doesn't have the Beck number, which makes it better. And it's also autographed by the commander, James McDivitt. So this is a nice cover. And I think I paid maybe $60 for it. Maybe it's worth $100, where a prime recovery ship with the Beck number and maybe without the autograph is maybe a $10 or $20 cover. But here's the question. When you look at this, obviously the VIP label tells you something, the Beck cachet tells you something, the autograph tells you something, but do you need that to tell the story? And the answer is you don't, because you could just take off the autograph and we're still telling the same story, right? Well, heck, you don't need the cachet either, right? Well, you don't even need the stamp. The only thing you really need to tell an astrophilatelic story is a postmark, because on that day, in that place, something happened. And that's the story we're telling. So you could have something, and here's an example, that doesn't have a stamp, hasn't been mailed anywhere, doesn't have an address or a cachet or anything like that, but this is quintessential astrophilatelic. So what this is this is part of a mission flight plan from Apollo 11. So this is the first crew to walk on the moon. And they were given a postal canceling device by the post office department and asked to have a ceremony on the surface of the moon. And they decided that they were going to be too busy. They were only going to be on the surface for maybe 90 minutes. And they had to pick up rocks and take pictures and plant the flag and all this kind of stuff. They weren't going to have time to have a postal ceremony. But what they said was, if you give us an envelope and a backup envelope and a canceling device, it's going to take us 3 days to get there and 3 days to get back. At some point, we will cancel this thing in outer space. So that's what they did. So it turns out that they wanted to make sure that they made a nice impression on the envelope. So they did a test impression on their flight plan. And they actually did 3 of these. Each one of the guys got to keep a test impression. And this one is from Buzz Aldrin. And so he canceled on the back of his flight plan. And it's a device. And it's got a location, it's kind of a spurious location. It says Moon Landing, USA, but you kind of know what it is, and the date. And this is telling an astrophilatelic story, even though we don't have routes or rates or cachets or autographs or anything like that. It's a postmark. So in addition to what you can exhibit, we collect these space events, and we, like anybody who's a first day cover collector, we love some of the cachets and collect them and collect every little variety, even though the postmarks are exactly the same. Now, there are a couple of instances where you can show an envelope that's a first day cover. Normally, a first day cover is verboten in exhibiting in Astrophilately. And the reason is, you look at the one on the left, and that's for the Viking mission to Mars. And it's canceled in Hampton, Virginia on July 20th, 1978. And the question in Astrophilately is, what happened in Virginia on July 20th, 1978? And the answer is, a stamp came out. It was the first day of a stamp. So that doesn't tell an astrophilatelic story, even though you've got a picture of, a craft landing on Mars. So simply having a stamp that's got a rocket on it, or having a first day cover that, none of that stuff is astrophilately. It may be a topical or a thematic representation of something related to space, but it's not astrophilately. Now, an exception to that, there are two exceptions, and one of them is the one on the right. So this is one for Project Mercury. This was a surprise stamp that came out, and they wouldn't release the stamp. They wouldn't tell the postmasters what this new stamp was until they knew that the astronaut had been safely removed from the water. So John Glenn orbits the Earth in 1962, and once they get him onto the aircraft carrier, they send out word to the postmasters and they say, you can open up this new stamp. And it's this Project Mercury stamp, and there's a first day of issue, Well, it turns out that because the first day of issue was at Cape Canaveral, where they launched the rocket, and it's on the right date, this is astrophilately, even though it's a first day cover. And the same is true for the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975. They issued a stamp on that day at the Kennedy Space Center. So you can use that in astrophilately, even though it's a first day cover. So when you look at these, here are two. The first Apollo mission was there was a tragedy. There was a fire in 1967, and it killed the crew. So postmarks from that fire are rare and they're valuable. So when we look at this one on the left, and they kind of look like, morning covers, they got a black border to them. And so you look at this and it says January 27, 1967, which is the right date. But it's not astrophilatelically correct because it's canceled in Port Washington, New York. And the question is, what happened in Port Washington, New York on that day? And the answer is a stamp dealer lived there. So that doesn't count. So here's the one on the right, very similar. January 27th. This one's canceled at the Kennedy Space Center, which is right. But this is a 20th anniversary cover. It's canceled in 1987. So anniversary covers generally are not acceptable in astrophilately. There are a couple of exceptions. So, for example, if you wanted the 50th anniversary of Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier, for example, there weren't any covers on that day. So we'll accept the 50th anniversary sort of cover. So there are a couple of we'll let things slide. But generally, an anniversary one doesn't count. We want to have a little bit of a challenge. So you need to find stuff that was canceled on the right days. We describe things between hand cancels and machine cancels. The one on the left, you can see is the circle date stamp is larger. It's got the circle date stamp and then the killer bars to the right. And then over on the right, which I think that's a universal, is a machine cancel. And then in addition to the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo space shuttle, we're also interested in telling the story that occurred before that, the stuff that led up to it. So we're interested in stratospheric balloons. We're interested in V2s because V2s are rockets as opposed to jets. X-planes, experimental airplanes, as long as they're rockets and not jets. And the reason is because rockets, that rocket technology can operate in space and jets can't. Rockets bring their own oxidizer, they bring their own oxygen, and in space, jets don't work. And missile mail and things like that. So we tell stories with this stuff as well. In addition to the launch, the during the mission, the landing, the splashdown in the water, there are some other things associated with them. So, for example, tracking stations. We needed to have worldwide radio communication, not only for voice, but also for data to be able to telemeter information to and from the spacecraft. And that all needed to be line of sight. So if if the spacecraft were on the other side of the world, you needed to transmit that information from tracking station to tracking station until you had one that was line of sight with the spacecraft, and then you could exchange information. So this particular one is from the final Apollo mission in 1972 in Australia. Now, what we're looking at the bottom, lower left, it's May 18th, 1969 at the Kennedy Space Center. So what happened on that day? And the answer is the dress rehearsal for the first landing on the moon. So this is Apollo 10. And what NASA came up with were postcards that you could get if you were at the launch site when the rocket went up. And you could get as many as 5 of these, and you could send them to your family and friends. And so these are called VIP postcards. And so it's got the right date and the right location, and it's got a nice looking, cachet and stuff. So that would be something these would be appropriate for an exhibit. There are a couple of other ways of slicing the same day in the same location. So the one on the left, it's got the mission emblem, which is very common, but you can see it also has a couple of devices underneath it, some Air Corps wings and an astronaut pin, and it's autographed by the crew. And this is something called an insurance cover. So what happened, starting with Apollo 11, one of the friends named Al Bishop of the astronauts said, hey, would you like me to get you some philatelic covers that you could autograph and leave with your family? And if anything happens, they'd be worth a lot of money. You could sell them and pay off the house or put the kids through college or something like that. So they called these insurance covers, and the crews did that. And so they would be autographed by the crew. One of the other astronauts would take it to the post office on the day of the launch, and they'd be left with the families. And then when they got back, these were handed out as favors, or they started selling them. So, for example, this one here from Apollo 15 sells for $200 or $300, and some of the other ones are significantly more. And Apollo 11, because Armstrong is so popular, will be several $1,000s. So that's an insurance cover. What we're looking at on the lower right, it's difficult to see, but it says USS Randolph, which was the prime recovery ship for John Glenn in 1962. And because they were proud of their participation in the space program, the Navy ships that were assigned to the Recovery Task Force would often make up their own caches, and you could get that envelope on the ship. Now, this wasn't something that was sold. This was just given to the crew. And so it was at the direction of the captain that he said, hey, let's make up a commemorative envelope that the crew can have. So the very first one was for John Glenn's flight. And instead of printing it on the envelope, they printed it on a label and then glued it on, which is what we're looking at here. And often these captain's covers are signed by the commanding officer. So that one is. And then, in addition to these commemorative kinds of things that are on the ground, some of the envelopes that we show in Astrophilately were carried into space. So, for example, this one is one of 3 different kinds, designs that was carried to the moon. So they had a total of 214 envelopes that were split amongst the 3 astronauts, and they all signed them. And they were carried in the command module to the moon and back. And so you get a very odd astrophilatelic question here. So you look at this, and the first thing you do is you look right at the postmark and you say, what happened in Webster, Texas on August 11th, 1969? And the answer is nothing. Okay. Now, Webster, Texas is right around the corner from Mission Control. So Webster is considered a Houston, Texas postmark, and that's fine. It's fine to show that. But the question is, what happened on August 11th? You know, the mission was well over. But if you look underneath it, it says delayed in quarantine because we didn't know if these guys were going to have space bugs or something like that. So it was on August 11th, 1969, that they were able to get the envelopes out and get them to the post office to cancel. So this is one of those rare exceptions where we will allow somebody to show this, because even though you don't think of anything really happening on August 11th, 1969 in Webster, Texas, this is so central to our Philatelic story that we permit it. And by the way, these are $25,000, $25,000 to $30,000. All right, so you ready for your quiz?
Yes.
I know you guys have been studying, because you strike me as driven people. So here's the first question. So remember to unmute, and here's the first question. So this is a cover from John Glenn's Mercury Atlas 6 mission in 1962, and you see it's got a nice cachet on it, and it's got the right date. It says February 20, 1962. So what's wrong with this picture?
It's the cancel. It's got nothing to do with the rocket, has it?
When you say the cancel, can you elaborate?
Cachet. Well, the
franking.
The Indian Rocks beach.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Don't worry about the cachet. You focus on the circle date stamp. And Indian Rocks Beach is, I don't know, it's maybe 15 miles from where John Glenn took off. But it isn't where he took off, and it isn't where he landed, and it wasn't the controlling place. Right. So the location doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you the story. So this is not something you could show. You ready for the next one?
Yes.
Okay. So this one is a flyby by Jupiter for an unmanned Pioneer 11 spacecraft. And here you see it says Pioneer 11, and it passed by Jupiter really close, just 26,000 miles. And it passed by on December 3rd, 1974. And you see it's canceled December 3rd, 1974. So what's wrong with this picture?
I presume it didn't take off from Kennedy Space Center.
I'm sorry.
Oh no! It's to do with the planet. It says Saturn.
Oh no! Don't worry about that.
I thought you said it was to Jupiter.
Well, yes. Yeah, they ended up renaming this. Don't worry about the cachet. Always start with the postmark. What's wrong with the postmark?
The command center was at Houston.
Well,
I guess.
Ordinarily it would be. If it was a manned space flight, it would be Houston. You're on the right track. So keep at it. What's wrong with the postmark?
Should it be PM rather than AM?
I'm sorry?
Should it be PM rather than AM?
No. No, I mean we might give you extra marks if you knew that, or if it was in the AM, and yeah.
Nothing happened at Kennedy. Nothing happened at Kennedy that day specifically.
I'm sorry?
Nothing happened specifically at Kennedy that day.
Exactly. So where would this have been appropriate? What's the right postmark?
From wherever it was launched.
Jupiter in America.
No, not where it's launched.
No,
it was launched from Kennedy Space Center. Had this been, if the cachet on the left had said that this was the launch, and if it had launched on that day, then the Kennedy Space Center would be appropriate. But nothing happened at Kennedy Space Center on that day. So where should this have been canceled?
Houston.
No, Houston is only for manned space flight. Anybody know?
Nope.
This might be a little tough. So this would be the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. So Caltech has an arrangement with NASA and, Vandenberg and all of this unmanned stuff is all done in California. So it would need to have a California postmark. This has a Florida postmark, which is appropriate for the launch, but this isn't telling you the story about Pioneer passing by Jupiter. That would be by the people that control it, and they control it at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
Hmm.
All right. Now this one is kind of tough, so I'm gonna give you this one. So this is for the first Apollo mission to fly around the moon. This was at Christmas in 1968, and they took off on December 21st. And the rockets that took off in Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo up until this point were all at the Kennedy, all at Cape Canaveral. Cape Canaveral, and they ended up renaming it Kennedy Space Center. Either one of those is acceptable. But once you get to the really big rockets, and the Saturn V, the one that took them all the way out to the moon, those only happened at the Kennedy Space Center, not at Cape Canaveral. So you would have to know, as an astrophilatelist, not only which ship picked up the astronauts, and there's nothing on those envelopes that tells you that, but you would also have to know, looking at this envelope, not just that the rocket took off from Florida or that day, but you'd have to know, oh, because it's a Saturn V, it took off from the Kennedy Space Center. It could not have taken off from Cape Canaveral. So
I thought they were the same place.
Well, it's quite confusing. It's quite confusing. There was a Port Canaveral, a Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, a Kennedy Space Center, and they exchanged the names back and forth, and it's a mess. It's a big mess. But there actually is a distinction between Cape Canaveral in 1968 and the Kennedy Space Center. And if it's a Saturn V, it needs to be from the Kennedy Space Center.
Okay.
Bill covers exist from the Kennedy Space Center.
Oh, certainly. Oh, certainly.
For that actual mission.
Oh, yes. Most of them do. As a matter of fact, I picked this one up. I picked this one up kind of by mistake, and when I got it, I'm like, it's the wrong place. But it's fine. It was $5, and that's the way it is. It's got an autograph on it. All right, so let's try this one. Okay, so this is the second crew to land on the moon, Apollo 12, splashdown, and they returned to Earth on November 24th, 1969. And what's wrong with this picture?
Should have USS Hornet cancel.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You guys are getting great at it. So the people that did this were just plain lazy. All right. So now you could have, for example, you could have in November 24th, 1969 cancel from Houston, because they were controlling the mission right up to the point where it hit the water. So, that would be okay. But you couldn't have a launch one, or you couldn't have one from Cape Canaveral, and they didn't launch any Saturn V's from Cape Canaveral. So this is a totally, I paid $1 for it. All right, so try this one out. So this is a Nike Apache rocket, and it left from the NASA facility at Wallops Island. And actually that's the right date, July 14th, 1966. Can anybody see what's wrong with this envelope? And I'll give you a hint, it's not the postmark. The postmark is actually correct.
Is it the picture of the rocket?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a picture of a Saturn 1B. That's, that massive rocket would not be taking off out of Virginia. So,
yeah.
Someone's being real lazy here. And so from an astrophilatelic perspective, as a judge, I might accept this envelope because the postmark is correct. But this is just plain too lazy. You can't find a picture of a sounding rocket, and instead you're going to put a moon rocket on there. So, yeah, this may be technically correct, but it's silly. All right, let's try this one. So this is the day that the first American in space passed away. He died on July 21st, 1998. So what's wrong with this? Why can't you exhibit this?
Probably because he didn't die at Kennedy Space Center.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, telling the story of the history of space travel, we really wouldn't have an envelope, heralding the birth of an astronaut or the death of an astronaut, or that sort of stuff. That we really don't do that kind of stuff. But you're right, didn't happen at Kennedy Space Center, and But what else is wrong with this picture? Anything else?
That doesn't look like Alan B. Shepard, actually, the picture.
Who is it?
Yuri Gagarin?
It's Yuri Gagarin.
Yuri Gagarin.
I mean, talk about being lazy. All right. Good job, guys. All right. So try this one. So here is first around the moon, and they were orbiting the moon on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1968. And what's wrong with this picture?
Could be Houston. Is it for the council?
Yes. Yes, it has to be at Houston, and this is at Cape Canaveral. Anything else you don't like?
Well, Father Marquette didn't go
The
there.
canoe seems funny.
I'm sorry?
The canoe seems funny.
The
Cachet?
canoe.
The
The
cachet?
canoe doesn't seem right in the design for the stamp, but I mean,
Yeah.
I suppose that doesn't matter, does it?
Oh, the canoe. Oh, no. Nothing wrong with the canoe. No, look at the spacecraft.
Is it the flying saucers at the back?
No, the capsule's separate from the.
Yeah, the capsule has separated from the service module,
Yeah.
which is fine as long as you're ready to re-enter. But if you do it while you're out at the moon, you've got some serious problems. So why they did that, I have no idea. All right. So anyhow, you guys have gotten very good at that. Are you hanging in there? You doing okay?
Yeah.
All right, good. So a couple of other things that we collect. One is we collect autographs. So here's the one on the left. This was canceled at Port Canaveral on May 5th, 1961, which was the day that Alan Shepard went into space. And that's Port Canaveral is considered an acceptable envelope to show. And when I bought this, it was autographed by John Glenn and also by Gus Grissom. And the Grissom autograph is difficult to find because most of these guys lived to a ripe old age. Gus Grissom died in the fire in 1967. So having something that was autographed by him is nice. And he mostly wrote Gus Grissom. So have something that says Virgil I. Grissom was great. And John Glenn, when he first started writing, wrote John H. Glenn Jr. And by the time he was finished, it was just kind of John Glenn. And Alan Shepard, when he first was signing, he would sign it Alan B. Shepard Jr. And by the time I met him at the National Air and Space Museum to get him to autograph my book, he just signed things AS. And that was just kind of it. He was kind of done with it. So Life magazine was doing a story on the Mercury astronauts, and it hadn't been determined who was going to be the first in space. And so they had an issue that came out, and it said on it, the gold team. And it had a picture of 3 astronauts. And it was Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, and John Glenn. And they said, NASA's told us that one of these 3 guys is going to be the first American in space. So when I got this envelope, and it was autographed by Glenn and by Grissom, I thought, oh, the only one that's missing here is Alan Shepard, and that was the day that his rocket took off. So I sent it to him. And I said, would you sign this Alan B. Shepard Jr.? And he sent it back, and it was signed Alan Shepard, which was kind of the way he signed when, I guess, in 1990 or so, when I sent it to him. And I was just grateful to get it back and have it autographed. So here, I kind of call this my gold team cover. And what we're looking at on the right is a lithograph, and it's got some of them are autographs and some of them are auto pens. And if you could see, the second pilot to the right is Alan Shepard. And if you could see the way it's written there, it says Alan B. Shepard Jr. And if you look at the P in Shepard, I don't know if you can see right here, this P, it's got a line above the P, which you don't see here. And his secretaries would sign his name, and they would sign his name with a line above the P, and he didn't. So when you see something that looks like his autograph, but it's got a line above, we call that a secretarial. There are also things called auto pens, which is a mechanical device which replicates an authentic autograph. So over here on the left is an envelope that was on the primary recovery ship, the Intrepid, March 23rd, 1965, and it's autographed by the captain of the boat. So that's a nice cover to have in the exhibit. And it looks like it's autographed by the crew, by John Young and Gus Grissom, but it turns out those are actually auto pens. So I think I paid $5 or $10, and that's about what that's worth. If the Young and the Grissom autograph were genuine, that'd be more like $1,000. The cover on the right is really quite interesting, in that a woman contacted me and said, I hear you collect space event covers. Here's one, and I think it's worth a lot of money because it's autographed by the pilot, by Gus Grissom. And I got back to her and I said, this is a wonderful envelope. It's worth a lot of money, but not for the reason that you think. I told her the thing that looks like an autograph is actually an auto pen and essentially has no value. Maybe it's $5 or something like that. But I said the postmark, on the other hand, is quite valuable because the suborbital flights, the Lake Champlain that picked up Alan Shepard and the Randolph, which picked up Gus Grissom, very few were postmarked. And this is postmarked July 21st, 1961 on the Randolph. And so that postmark is worth $500,000, $1,500. And the thing that looked like an autograph has no value. So she ended up getting good money, but not for the reasons she thought. Other things that kind of look like autographs, there are ones that are printed. The one on the left is actually, they call it flocked. So it's got a little bit of like fuzzy stuff and it's baked in an oven. And it looks like an autograph, but it's actually printed. And then there are forgeries. So here's a cover that looks like it's very valuable because it's signed by Gus Grissom and Werner von Braun and Alan Shepard. And it's postmarked on the ship that picked up Grissom. But everything about this is a fake. The postmark is a fake. And a guy who was a legitimate space dealer was not only selling legitimate covers, but he was also a forger. And he created these postmarks, which are incredibly difficult to determine.
It's Mr. Roessler.
Roessler, Charles Roessler. And they're
Roessler,
very, very difficult to uncover. Some of the ways that you can tell that this is a forgery, first of all, virtually all of his stuff was done on postal stationery. Most of it was done without stamps. Also, one of the addresses that he used was FC Shade. So if something is addressed to FC Shade and it's on postal stationery, it is a fake. It's a forgery. There is some disagreement in our community about whether or not autographs on Roessler forgeries are forgeries as well. I've had a discussion with another collector, and I looked at these autographs, and to me, they look good to me. They look like they're real. And he said, no, they're fakes too. So the general consensus is just kind of, if you see autographs on a Reiser forgery, I didn't mean Rossler, I meant Reiser, Charles Reiser, then they're no good as well. Some of the caches that we collect, one is called Spacecraft, which they did a remarkable job, very accurate. And what they would do with these caches is they'd go ahead and get the stamps postmarked, and then they would print the caches afterwards once they had all of the details about the flight, and they got some beautiful artwork done. So they're wonderful and very accurate representations of what was going on that space flight. So we really like these spacecraft ones. Over on the right is one of the contractor covers. So Bendix was a major subcontractor in the Apollo program. So they put out a series of caches. Velvetone, this is the flocked material. And the guy would do about 50 of these covers for each launch, and he'd put it in his wife's oven and bake them. And that's how this stuff came to be. What we're looking at the right, I'm just finishing a monograph, writing a monograph on official caches. These are rubber stamp caches that were applied at the Kennedy Space Center on the days of launches between 1965 and 1975. And so these are very collectible. The most expensive one being the one from the Apollo fire, because it was never actually issued. But somebody who was friends with somebody at the post office had 50 of them made, and they're very valuable. Over on the left here, this is a Goldcraft that was canceled on the ship, and I sent it off to Scott Carpenter and had him autograph it. On the right is a real old school producer. His name was Flick. And here you can see the Beck cache there on the left, and you can see it's got a B number, and that's on the Lake Champlain, which picked up that Mercury capsule. And then some of them are hand done. So the one on the right was an artist who worked for the World Telegraph and Sun, and he was a stamp collector. And so he'd make 2 or 3 of these. And so this is one for one of the Monkey flights when they were testing out the Mercury spacecraft. Centennial did some wonderful stuff. And even the US Postal Service, they decided, they had the arrangement with NASA where they took this express mail stamp and they put a cachet on it, and they did both the launch and the return, and they put it in the cargo bay of the space shuttle. And they did 600,000 of these, and we're selling them at the post office for about $15 a piece. And you can still get them on eBay for about $15 or $20. So anybody who wants to get something that's been in outer space, that's pretty cool. I mean, that's definitely Astrophilately, and the most inexpensive space cover you'll ever, one that's actually been flown that you'll ever find. And then there are the hand-painted ones. These are examples of a gentleman that lives in Scandinavia who I send him envelopes that have rare postmarks on them, but they don't have any cachet. And I'm like, well, I want to tell this story. So he does his artistry. So on the left, for example, when we were sending up Discoverer, which was actually the Corona spy satellites, they would develop the film in the capsule, and the capsule would come back to Earth, and a C-119 would fly and snatch the capsule before it hit the water in the Pacific. And so here he is showing us, exactly what's going on. And so, yes, the April 13, 1959 at Vandenberg tells you the Astrophilatelic story, but I think it's so much more visually interesting to have the cachet. And the same thing with the monkey. This is Ham, one of the monkeys that flew in space. And I love the artistry, you know, what this guy did. You know, you could imagine, here's this monkey that's living in Africa, and he gets captured and put in a cage and brought to the United States and fed different kinds of food and talked to, and then gets put in a capsule, and then he's flying around the world. I mean, what a remarkable existence. And in addition to being an exhibitor and a judge and a collector, I also do some micro publishing. So people who write stuff on the subject that I'm interested in, I print small quantities of it. I sell it on my website. So Steve Durst, for example, writes about American subjects, and Jim Reichman, a retired Air Force guy, is just prolific like you wouldn't imagine. I have on my site probably 40 books that he's written on all of these very, very narrow focused topics that he has on Soviet astrophilately. So any question that you'd ever want to know about the Russians and space flight, he has in one of his books. And when I first met him, and I saw one of these, it was just on a DVD. I said, you know, where can I get this? And he says, oh, nowhere. I don't do anything with them. I said, well, why are you doing it? And it's all formatted. It's all, you know, as a book. And he says, I just do it for myself. And I said, well, let me, you know, print it. So I print a half dozen at a time, and when I run out of them, I print some more. And then I've written a book called American Astrophilately, the First 50 Years. And it has, it's divided into 3 sections. The first section are 13 guest authors who write about different aspects, about stratospheric balloon flights, about KSC officials, about prime recovery ships, all the different aspects of collecting this stuff. The second section is kind of a gallery that shows you examples of different kinds of covers that you could use in an exhibit, and it tells you who the cachet maker is and all that sort of stuff. And then the last section has just the postmarks to show you which are the rare postmarks to look for. And that's the kind of thing that somebody might take like to a stamp show and say, oh, well, you know, this is the postmark for the prime recovery ship for this particular flight. And, you know, that's of use. So to give you an example, the USS Hornet, July 24th, 1969, picking up the Apollo 11 astronauts, you can get that postmark on an envelope on eBay for $2, okay? Because they printed 250,000 of them on the ship. In contrast, if you wanted to get one from the Lake Champlain from May 5th, 1961, from Alan Shepard's flight, it cost $3,000 because there are only 44 of them. So knowledge is power, right? So people that walk around with this book, they're able to see this was the prime recovery ship. This is the one that has value. The ones that are secondary recovery ships are worth $1 if they're worth that. So the book both educates you about the subject, shows you a lot of artwork, and then in the end, helps collectors and dealers who are interested in the subject. And so my website is www.americanastrophilately.com. And that's my shameless self-promotion.